Hello, Dr. Brown, Brandon Brown from the Tisch for Global Sport. How you doing today?
I'm good, sir. How are you? Dean
Doing
Gennaro, thank
great.
you so much for having me.
Yeah, Vince Gennaro, the Associate Dean of the Tisch for Global Sport, and we're here today to have one of our chalk talks, and we're really going to talk about relating to the coronavirus. When do we think, and what will it take for sports to come back into our realm again? Just last night, we saw the NFL draft live on TV, on ESPN. Of course, it was people in many different locations, even general managers and head coaches of football teams in completely separate locations, of course, in their home, not to mention the first round candidates to be drafted and so forth. So we got a little flavor of the real-time sports, although it wasn't a game, back on TV last night.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to talk about, not only which sports are going to come back before others, but how are we going to see sports come back? And then just maybe some ideas that might be great for the implementation of sports, but might not be practical money-wise. And so it might just not make sense financially. And so some of the good ideas might be foregone.
This is a topic that you, I'm sure, talk about in your class with your students. It's got to be very topical right now. So what are some of the things that you get into and your students have thought of or you've discussed in class on this topic?
Yeah, so in my orgs and sports class, it's kind of like a survey course of how organizational structures are set up. We've gone over professional sports, we've gone over collegiate athletics, we've gone over Olympic sports. So we've kind of broken down each one of those in terms of kind of almost revenue structure. And then we just recently brought into the conversation about how this whole pandemic is going to affect all of it. So one of the conversations that we've had for each one of those topics, professional, collegiate, and Olympics, is just how this is going to affect revenue structures. And if they are going to be drastically affected, when is the next time we're going to see something come back? And then if something does come back, say if all of a sudden we see a bump in the amount of cases again, is it going to devastate some of the sports that we know today? So one of the big topics is, we talk about revenue structures in professional sports, for example, and we break it down into 4 different aspects about how a given professional sports team can make money. And so one of these is sponsorship. The other is merchandise. Other is gate receipts. And the other is media rights. And so I think every single one of those are going to be affected. But when we talk about sponsorship and we talk about gate receipts, gate receipts, not just ticket sales, but everything, what happens when you come into the gate, they're losing all of that. That might be 25% of their revenue. And then when you talk about sponsorship, sponsors are now possibly renegotiating deals that are happening. Media rights, media are renegotiating deals. And without all of those things, you don't have merchandise sales. So you're seeing a big time dip in all of the areas that make revenue for the teams.
Yeah. And in some cases, you mentioned 25% for gate receipts, but in some cases, it's even significantly more than that if the sport is not a media darling property, but more of a live event. One of the questions I think is really intriguing is how will we know when it's time to return? In other words, what will the calculus be around a safe return? I mean, what does that look like in your mind? How do you process through that? What have the people you've talked to?
Yeah, so it's funny because everyone keeps on saying, well, we got to just wait until it's completely done. And that's a tough ask. Like in all reality, to make this thing go away completely, I don't know if we're going to see that for a very, very long time. So there is the possibility that we'll start to see small implementations of select sports coming back before this whole thing is gone. Now, it's going to definitely depend on antibody information with how that they're going to implement, how that's going to protect us as a society, or obviously the vaccines that are going to come into existence, and that might take care of a lot of things. But if things are going, we are likely going to see sports start to implement while there's a small percentage of people having the corona. Do you think that's the same? Do you think it's not going to be like that?
No, I certainly agree with that. I think it's impractical to get to zero risk.
Right.
To wait for that point, rather. I mean, we will get to that point at some point or close to zero, but that's not the threshold for reopening. We have to really understand better what the risk factors are, and so that we can best make that calculation and see what the consumer sentiment is to when they feel comfortable when the risk is low enough. For example, I mean, we're willing to tolerate 40,000 auto deaths a year without putting restrictions on how people can drive, when they can drive, and so forth. I mean, there are, licensing rules and so forth for competency and so on. But, right now, you would think the coronavirus risk is exponentially more than that 40,000. We're already past 50,000. And we're doing all sorts of social distancing, and the virus is in its early phase. So I don't know what the upside, if we unconstrained ignored the virus, 5 million, 10 million, 15 million, 20 million people die, I don't know. So obviously we're not at a point right now where an unbridled, return to normal, the old normal, is practical. But I feel like we need to get to a point where we have a sense of the number of and percentage of people who already have antibodies. We saw some data just in the last couple of days that in New York, there are some estimates that in New York City, over 20% of the people have antibodies. I'm not really sure on the genesis and the details of all that study. And in the state of New York, it was something like 13.5%. That's by, April 22nd or so. So, the question is, how do we process through all that and know when it's the right time? But it's because I do think we are as rational citizens prepared to accept a level of risk. I believe it's nowhere near the risk level today, but it's also not zero. So that it's a very important and intriguing question.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard from somebody, we were talking to Dr. Bill Sutton last night, and he said, or he thinks that what's going to happen in kind of the next wave of things, and he's already heard from a couple of different organizations, instead of a CMO or a COO, they're going to have a chief health officer. Every single team is probably now going to have to hire someone in charge of their specific health standards, right? And they're going to kind of deal with whatever goes on within their particular arena. So that'll be interesting. I think that's the next step. But I think it's also interesting to have a conversation, Vince, about which sports are likely to come back first, and really which sports are you going to see just chase the almighty dollar and come back regardless of if they should come back or not. Because when you talk about a sport like baseball, they're far away. You can make the case that everyone could wear gloves when touching the baseball. Not everyone even touches the baseball. But then all of a sudden football, which might stand to make some more money, you're talking about linemen in each other's face. You're talking about a number of people all together, much more crowded. Then all of a sudden one team, if one person gets sick on one team, that might affect the whole team, which means they might have to sit out the next week, which might, there's a bunch of implications for football in comparison to baseball. Do you think that we're going to see certain sports kind of act before others?
Yeah, I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is the PGA Tour and golf. Mm-hmm. Golf is almost made for social distancing. You give the player you're playing with his space or her space for a lot of reasons, including the swinging of the club and so forth, and you want to give them the ability to concentrate on their shot. So social distancing is natural, and I think it would be minor modifications to ensure it. You would not have fans in that scenario. Of course, you've got TV crew and so forth, because the whole payoff of this would be to broadcast it on TV. I do think the sports that can come back would actually thrive in terms of viewership, because we are so starved for it. Another one that might work would be tennis. And again, the athletes have to be willing to engage and willing to put themselves at risk, because there would be some risk, clearly. But those are two of the sports that I think are seem to be a little bit more logically suited to this environment today. I don't know. What do
Yeah.
you think?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think you're exactly right. Now, you are seeing some, like in Taiwan, right? They're playing baseball right now, and I don't think there's been too many issues so far. But yeah, you're exactly right. Those sports right there, I think, are definitely conducive. You also brought up something, and there's so many different threads that we can pull from this. I totally, wholeheartedly agree with you that when sports do come back, people are starved for it. Does that make for possibly leverage from a sport organization talking to certain sponsors? Because right now, a lot of sponsors are backing out for example, with the Olympics or something like that. I mean, is there something to say from a sport organization's perspective to a sponsor that, hey, when we do come back, people are really going to have an affinity for this, possibly more so before? Is that a possible bargaining chip for sport organizations and sponsors?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and I think it's a slippery slope because, for example, in the fall of this year, if things go as they are preliminarily planned, you're going to have all sorts of events occurring at the same time, which presents the flip side of what you said, which is the dilution factor, right? If you have the Masters on November 12th through 15th, I believe, which is probably the ultimate pinnacle golf programming, and you have perhaps the Major League Baseball's participating and their maybe extended playoff run at that time, and maybe you'll have basketball, football, college football. Who knows? I mean, you're now, what you've done is you've shrunk the calendar down to where you're going to create competing events at the same window in time. And we all know how important it is to consume sports live. So it's not like, well, we'll watch the Masters, but we'll watch the basketball later. No, it doesn't work that way. So I think on the one hand, you can make the case you pointed out, there is a flip side to it.
Yeah. I wonder if therefore, like the Olympics, for example, have that much more of a bargaining chip on their side because it's just different from all those other events, and possibly the Olympics in particular got pushed back, this big giant event. So it's absolutely fascinating. Do you think there's going to be dire consequences for any given sport? I mean, for example, one of the things that we talked about in my orgs class was college football. And, a lot of these college football programs operate under the college football money, right? Like all of their other programs literally make a loss. College football is the only program within their entire sports structure which makes such gain that it can pay for every single other sport. So, for example, if you cancel a college football season, maybe for even just 1 year in some cases, 2 years in other cases, then literally entire sport departments are going to not exist.
Well, on that point, the cancellation we've already seen of the NCAA basketball tournament, which is a huge moneymaker for the schools, is going to impact D1 schools significantly in terms of their cash inflows. So, yeah, I mean, I think you raised some good points about, does this challenge the overall structure of college athletics if this goes on for too long, and how does one recover from that, and what steps are taken in the interim? So there's that, and there's also the question, Brandon, about when sports do come back, how do we transition from sports in a studio setting where they're made for TV without fans to the new normal for fans? And, I think there's a little bit of an illusion, and we're seeing it with the overall discussion that's going on about the economy, not just about sports. And that is, well, we need to open businesses. Well, what makes us think if we open businesses that people are going to flock to them in numbers that make the businesses that are reopening sustainable? I mean, we could find reopening businesses too early without the consumer confidence leads to greater economic loss than we have today, because you've called people back to work, you're spending to keep the utilities on, and now if it's a restaurant, you're operating your restaurant, but it's operating at 20%, 15% of your normal capacity. And so that might not be sustainable either. So there is no silver bullet. It's not just, well, we open businesses up and everything will be fine. We'll put people back to work. Well, those people can't retain their jobs if customers don't come. And I don't know if there's enough people who are willing to take this gamble and chance, knowing they can infect others. So it's, it's a crazy situation.
Yeah, and it's such a good point. So you have that, right, in terms of the fact that they just might not be making up for what they thought they would. But even some of these businesses that are quote unquote inelastic, like, so what I think of is barbershops, right? Like I hear so many people online saying, I need a haircut. I haven't gotten a haircut in so long. Those are quote unquote inelastics, so to speak, right? Because they open up and that's something that's always going to be needed and people are always going to come to barbershops. But not necessarily, like you just said. What if all of a sudden they find out that this is all of a sudden where I'm catching a disease or this is where I'm spreading something? So even some of these companies that think they're inelastic, well, people always can use haircuts or something like that. What if we find out that there's all of a sudden immense lack of demand because of unknown factors? Then all of a sudden these things aren't as inelastic as we thought.
Yeah. Well, you happen to pick a topic that I don't feel particularly qualified to speak about, which is haircuts. But actually, funny thing on that point, I learned pretty easily that I can take a razor with a certain setting and just get this job done and save myself $45 if I want to. So you learned about the substitution effect.
You know what? Joking aside, this whole thing has put a lot of people in situations that they haven't been in before, and they're learning to fend for themselves, right? So whether it's a haircut, which same thing with me, or whether it's just, you know what, I don't need this particular thing that I thought I needed. And as it relates to sports, before this pandemic, I was someone who was listening to podcast after podcast after podcast after podcast. And all of a sudden, little by little, these podcasts started to just dilute in terms of the fact that they don't have as much information. And so it wasn't enough to keep me coming back. And then all of a sudden, I've completely changed my consumption patterns in terms of podcasts. And even when sports start up again, I'm not sure I need to be consuming that much information, especially when I've seen through this pandemic that I don't have to, right? There's a lot of things that like this pandemic is forcing upon us that we're realizing, oh, we could possibly live without.
Yeah, and that's, that presents a risk to sports in some capacity. Will there be 5, 10, 15% of fans who were maybe not the most diehard fans to start with, but to say, you know what, I thought I was really into this, but I can live without this. I found other things in my life that I've substituted for this. And, it'll really, really be interesting.
Exactly. Do you think so? When people, or when they do start to open it up, when consumers are finally able to come to a sporting event, or even if it's players first without fans, what do you think it's going to look like?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a hard one to figure out, and I think it's going to differ for each sport. But I do think that I think the one thing we realize is that with all of the people yearning for it and talking about it, and amidst all the other crises we're in the middle of, by no means am I minimizing that, but I think we've recognized the importance that sports plays in our society. And it's very much deeply woven into the American culture. And it's somewhat even intrinsic to us, as you teach in your courses. And I think it's something we need. We don't need it at all costs, not at the cost of life, but it's something we need, and it's something that I think people will welcome with open arms to return.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, we talk a lot about the escape that sport provides, and now more than ever, do you need that escape? And it's just really tough that we're in a situation where we don't have it. And that's why, like you said, people are pining for the NFL draft. All of a sudden that comes on. The Last Dance was such a big deal for so many people because, you think about it, these things aren't actual sport. They're just things that are connected to second-handedly connected to sport, and people are that much into them.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks for taking the time to do this together with you today. I really enjoyed it, and we'll do more of it soon.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me. Yeah, we got so much to talk about. So we hopefully can be back again sometime soon.
Sounds great.